Thanks very much. Great to be down here with you folks this afternoon, this evening. Kind of unclear what time it is. I'll be talking about the forces shaping the landscape of the place we know as Vermont from billions of years ago through the present, based on the book that Gloria just mentioned, The Story of Vermont, A Natural and Cultural History, which I co-wrote with my colleague at Middlebury, Steve Trombulak, who's a conservation biologist. The first edition came out in 1999, and the second edition came out in 2015. And throughout the book, we focus on three main themes, which maybe to you might sound like common sense, but to academics were not so much common sense. First of all, natural history without the consideration of human actions is incomplete history. So some of you have maybe read some natural history books, and here are the birds, here are the trees, here are the flowers, etc., and humans don't play a role. In this book, as you'll see, and especially since I'm the one speaking this afternoon, humans play a major role, and obviously they do in what the landscape looks like. Second, any particular place, such as Vermont, is embedded within a larger context. And again, it's obvious to us today how Vermont is shaped by forces outside of Vermont's borders. But when we came to write this book, one of the things that we were unsettled with, we both taught a class about Vermont, and we're not happy with what we could read and the students could read. And one of the things was the maps of Vermont were all the state surrounded by white space, as if when you left the Vermont border, you just disappeared. And obviously that's not true. And so we had maps, the maps made for this book, and you'll see some of them this afternoon, all show what's going on in New York or Quebec or New Hampshire. And that third and finally, cultural forces have been the primary driver of recent changes to the ecology, species composition, species population in Vermont. Okay, and again, the significance of this framework you'll see throughout the talk, and we can return to it if you'd like later in our discussion section. I'm going to start from the introduction, and this is a photo from the top of Mount Abraham, which is kind of my local mountain. This is near Bristol, Vermont, fifth tallest mountain in the state. We begin this story from the top of Mount Abraham, the fifth tallest mountain in Vermont, on a clear June day. At an elevation of just over 4,000 feet, and with a small alpine meadow at its summit, this vantage point offers us a fine view. We see four different mountain ranges: the Greens extending to the north and south, the Adirondacks to the west, the Taconics to the southwest, and the Whites to the northeast. We see Lake Champlain and the Champlain Valley to the west, and the Mad River Valley to the east. We also get a clear view of the vegetation patterns of Vermont. To the south, that's what we're looking at here, the spine of the Green Mountains appears to be cloaked in green velvet. Much of the Mad River Valley and the ridge to the east are also forested. In the Champlain Valley, though, we see a more significant overlay of cultural or human forces at work. Superimposed on the geological and ecological layers are the most obvious works of humans: cropland, pastures, roads, villages, and houses. A closer look brings other cultural influences into clearer focus. We have arrived at the summit by way of the Long Trail, which follows the spine of the Green Mountains from Quebec to Massachusetts. The forests we see in three of the mountain ranges have been partially protected by conservation: the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont, the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire, and the Adirondack Park in New York. A bit of extra walking to the north would bring us to a chairlift in the Sugarbush ski area. This resort has influenced the landscape of the Mad River Valley, as similar resorts have influenced similar valleys elsewhere in the state. Land trusts have helped to protect farms and forests within our view. Our goal in this book and in this talk is to explain what it is we and you are seeing from the summit of Mount Abraham, or from any other place in Vermont, and to see it in such a way as to understand how patterns in both nature and culture here have been shaped over time. Fundamentally, the landscape we see is the result of three primary forces: geological, ecological, and cultural. The geological forces of mountain building, glaciation, and erosion are responsible for many of the principal topographic features found here. Ecological forces, on the other hand, are responsible for the region's ecosystems, which are the myriad combinations of plant and animal species that inhabit the landscape. And changes in climate caused by both natural and cultural forces have led to changes in how these ecosystems are distributed across the landscape. Finally, but by no means least important, cultural factors have played a significant role in shaping this landscape, especially in the years since large-scale European settlement began in the region. Perhaps most illustrative of these effects is the change in forest cover in Vermont during this period. The percentage of Vermont that is forested went from an estimated 95% in 1620 to 25 to 35% around 1850 to 1870 to more than 75% at the end of the 20th century. I'll begin with a brief description of the geological forces that have created the Vermont landscape. The first events, those that took place the longest time ago, were a series of mountain-forming episodes. This slide indicates the location of the four main mountain regions in the Vermont region today. We're here in the Taconics, Green Mountains, Adirondacks, and the White Mountains. Beginning 1.2 billion years ago, the collision of continents created mountains perhaps as tall as the Himalayas on the east coast of what is now North America. Although there are no traces of these mountains in Vermont today, rock from the mountains are at the core of the Green Mountains and the Adirondacks. Roughly 500 million years ago, further continental collisions created the Green Mountains and the Taconics. 20 to 40 million years ago, a localized hotspot created and continues to create the Adirondacks, young mountains made out of very old rock. Beside these episodes of mountain building, the major geological force shaping Vermont was the most recent ice age, from 2 million years ago through roughly 13,000 years ago. Here we see that virtually the entire Northeast and much of the upper Midwest was under ice 20,000 years ago. And this is around the time that this map depicts. When the ice cover was at its greatest extent, Vermont was under a mile-thick sheet of ice. This ice sheet was a major force of erosion and deposition and served to shape the flow of rivers and create the lakes on the landscape. This is an ice sheet taken out the window of a plane flying from Juneau to Anchorage, which is still there, but gives you a sense of what Vermont might have looked like at that time. In the wake of these retreating ice sheets, glacial dams created a number of large lakes, most notably Lake Hitchcock in the Connecticut River Valley in the eastern part of the state, and Lake Vermont in the Champlain Valley, covering where we find Lake Champlain today, but as you can see was much, much larger, both reaching their maximum extent roughly 13,000 years ago, which in kind of the geological time frame is not all that long ago. As the ice sheet receded, these glacial lakes eventually drained to the north, and in the Champlain Valley, the Champlain Sea was actually an arm of the Atlantic Ocean, taking the place of Lake Vermont. This reached its greatest extent about 11,000 years ago, and the sea teemed with marine life that served as a food source for the first native people to live in the region. As the crust rebounded from the tremendous weight of the ice sheet, the Champlain Valley rose above sea level, and the sea gradually changed to a smaller freshwater lake. With the retreat of the ice sheet, plants and animals began to colonize the Vermont, or recolonize the Vermont landscape. First came a tundra landscape approximated in this photo, again from Alaska. Small pieces of tundra remain on the tops of 3 of Vermont's tallest mountains. Over time, this tundra gave way to woodland and eventually a closed forest. Don't really need to have a photo of a forest because we're surrounded by forests today. About 4,500 years ago, the forests in Vermont came to resemble fairly closely the forests that were present at the time that the Europeans arrived, and didn't look too much different. If you were dropped into Vermont 4,500 years ago, this wouldn't look that different, the forests that you would see. Animals began to arrive at this time as well. Large mammals inhabited the tundra and open woodland. Creatures like the woolly mammoth, mastodon, giant short-faced bear, and my personal favorite, the giant beaver, which this is from the Natural History Museum in New York. This slide, this giant beaver was the size of a black bear. These species went extinct throughout North America around 10,000 years ago due to some combination of human hunting and climate change. And there's been a long debate among anthropologists and biologists over what was the actual cause. Arriving in the region around this time were many of the mammals that are still common today, or at least until a few hundred years ago, common in Vermont. Deer, black bear, timber wolves, catamount or mountain lions, wolverines, snowshoe hare, eastern chipmunk. Also arriving around this time were 4 succeeding native cultures. First came what have been called Paleo Indians. They hunted on the tundra and open woodland and hunted and fished in the Champlain Sea. The archaic people inhabited Vermont until roughly 4,500 years ago, when the natural landscape of Vermont developed into its present composition. These people evolved into the woodland culture, and they in turn evolved into the Abenaki, the people who were present in Vermont when Europeans arrived. This map shows, again, our best guess of the different areas inhabited by native peoples around the time that Europeans arrived in Vermont. And we're actually pretty close to a border here where the Abenaki kind of merged into the Mohawken folks in this southwestern corner of Vermont. Each of the 4 Vermont native cultures relied on hunting, fishing, and gathering to survive. Agriculture arrived very late in Vermont, and maybe June kind of can tell us why, this June. The earliest evidence of agriculture in Vermont was only about 900 years ago. And to the best of our knowledge, agriculture never replaced, as it did in other parts of New England and the rest of the United States, never replaced hunting, fishing, and gathering as the primary source of food for the natives here. They did farm, but it wasn't, again, they weren't a settled agricultural people. And this was very different, especially from southern New England. The population of the Abenaki around 1600 is estimated to be between 4,000 and 10,000 people in the Champlain Valley and 2,000 to 6,000 people in the Connecticut Valley. Another little snippet here. Like all humans, the Native Americans who first came to Vermont had an effect on the environment and were in turn affected by it. Prior to the arrival of the Europeans, though, the effect of humans on the Vermont landscape was minimal compared with what was soon to come, with the exception of the probable role of the Paleo Indians in the extinction of large mammals throughout North America. These Native Americans had low population densities and lived lightly off the land. They hunted at sustainable levels, made minimal use of fire, and did not disturb much land for farming. They relied on wood for heating and cooking, for tools and canoes. They followed a cyclical pattern of life, tied to seasons and foods, and had a very strong relationship with place. In the native worldview, all living things had the ability to act favorably or unfavorably toward humans. This led to a kind of respect for nature, although current society must be careful not to impute a modern environmental consciousness to a people far removed from our time and thinking. In sum, these native peoples had developed a successful way of life in relation to the Vermont environment, one that changed little over 4,000 years as the Vermont landscape remained relatively stable. With the European arrival and the conquest of the Abenaki, this way of life was replaced with a completely different mode of interaction with the environment. The arrival of colonists in New England led to what environmental historian Carolyn Merchant has called an ecological revolution. This colonial ecological revolution resulted in the replacement of the native peoples with Europeans as the dominant humans in the region, as well as a fundamental shift in the ecosystems of the region and in how humans interacted with these natural systems. The Europeans greatly altered the existing landscape, brought new animals and plants, and fully replace the human way of life that had developed in Vermont over the previous 10,000 years. Overall, when the British replaced the Abenaki as the primary inhabitants, an ecological revolution took place in Vermont that had a number of significant effects on the landscape. The minimal effect on the land of the perhaps 8,000 Abenaki farming, fishing, gathering, hunting, and using fire modestly was overshadowed by the activities of the colonists, who numbered more than 150,000 by 1800. Growing European populations combined with introduced disease organisms, domesticated animals, grain production, and vast forest clearing changed the Vermont environment in ways beyond the means and vision of the Abenaki. But there was more. The Abenaki economy had been almost exclusively a local subsistence one, with some trade among neighboring tribes. With the arrival and dominance of the British, the economy of Vermont and in the rest of New England became part of an emerging capitalist system centered on the North Atlantic. Beaver populations were now subject to the whims of fashion in Europe. An expanding British Navy meant more tall, straight white pines cut for ship masts. The Vermont landscape became a set of natural resources for a population much larger than those 150,000 people in the state. Forevermore, the nature of human-environment interaction in Vermont would be influenced profoundly by what happened beyond its borders. This map depicts levels of settlement in New England, and the darker the color, the earlier settlement occurred. And so you can see, I think this takes us up to around 1840 or so, that even a few pockets of Vermont are not at this time unsettled. The Adirondacks is largely unsettled. But again, especially compared to southern New England, the Hudson Valley, Vermont very late to be settled. Really not until the 1760s. Prior to this time, Vermont was a battleground between the French and the British and their Indian allies. The British defeat in Quebec of the French in Quebec settled things politically, and so in the 1760s, settlers soon began to move into Vermont. Really one of the first or last remaining frontiers in the Northeast. Due to disputes between New York and New Hampshire over which colony controlled Vermont, Vermont actually was an independent republic from 1777 to 1791. And in 1791, it became the first state added to the United States. And if we could discuss further in Q&A if you'd like, Vermont actually kind of joined with some towns in New Hampshire for a while and with some towns in New York when they were an independent republic. How have European descendants affected the Vermont landscape? I want to discuss the importance in the rest of our time of five main factors: cutting the forests, agriculture, human population growth and related development, tourism, and conservation. First, cutting the forests. Vermont's forests were cleared for four main interrelated reasons: lumber, farmland, fuel wood, and potash. The decline in demand for fuel wood and potash, combined with the decline for of the timber industry and farming, allowed the forest to begin to return. Ecologists and foresters have estimated that 95% of Vermont was covered by forest when the Europeans arrived. This forest, they estimate, dropped to 82% in 1790, 58% by 1820, 47% by 1850, and bottomed out at 37% in 1880 before land forested began to increase. In the 1870s, it was in the 1870s that the Vermont landscape looked most different from the way it looked in 1609. A state almost completely covered by forest had been substantially cleared. From 1880, the chief change to the Vermont landscape was that it began to revert to forest, even though the relative abundance of some of the tree species in these regenerating forests were quite different from the century before. The percent of landscape covered by forest reached about 75% in 1980 and has remained roughly at that level since. The return of forests to the Vermont landscape that began in the middle of the 19th century came to, again, this rough equilibrium. It's now about 4.5 million acres, or 76% of the state. About 4/5 of this forest land is privately owned, the remainder publicly owned. With little coordination of management across numerous owners, each of whom will manage to achieve goals independent of one another, whether for firewood, pulpwood, saw logs, wood chip biomass, recreation, or wild nature, forest fragmentation and its ecological consequences have become the norm. Second, agriculture. Vermont farm families were largely self-sufficient through the first decades of the 19th century before making the transition to commercial agriculture. When farmers began to sell significant amounts of their crops, it was primarily wheat, hay, potatoes, and hops that they sold. But Vermont could not compete with its cheaper, flatter, and sometimes more productive lands of its western neighbors, and its role in growing crops began a steep decline before the Civil War. This was offset by increased specialization in livestock. First, sheep. Vermont enjoyed a boom in sheep, a veritable sheep mania, from 1830 to the Civil War, with Addison County at its center. The number of sheep in the state peaked around 1840 with 1.7 million. The sheep mania declined due to increased competition from the West and due to decline in the protective tariff. So Australia and South America began to supply more wool. So again, as you read the paper and listen to the radio today and hear about Vermont dairy farmers being buffeted by pressures beyond their control, this is nothing new, right? We can go back to the early 1800s, and the sheep case is a good one. Next came dairy farming around 1850, some cows. With the advent of iced butter railroad cars to Boston, that is what really made dairy production take off. At the peak of production, St. Albans had the largest creamery in the world. Butter and cheese production were up and down until the 1920s, when the technology to ship fluid milk, first by train and then by truck, to Boston and New York was developed. So again, nothing much has changed in the fluid milk business today. We're primarily involved in, again, we produce far more fluid milk here than we can consume, and it's going to Boston and New York. Supplying milk to these cities remains the foundation of Vermont's dairy industry, indeed of its entire agricultural economy. Yet dairy and dairy agriculture generally began to decline, depending on what we mean by decline, following World War II. The number of dairy farms, cows, and acreage and farmland all continued to sink from the 1990s levels. Yet milk production grew 5% from 1990 to 2010, indicative of the continuing technological developments in conventional dairy. Even with this growth in production, Vermont's share of the national milk market remained only a tiny fraction, slightly over 1% in 2010. Yet dairy maintained its role as the epicenter of Vermont agriculture, still constituting 70 to 80% of agricultural revenue in the state. Efforts to stabilize the dairy market continued in Washington with the Northeast Interstate Dairy Compact, formed by the New England states to support the wholesale price of fluid milk, in place from 1996 to 2001, followed by other federal programs to support dairy prices. With increasing chaos in Washington, continuing into the fall of 2013 and into the present, exemplified by the expiration of the Farm Bill, federal programs may no longer provide much protection for conventional dairy farmers. Indeed, it has been since the middle of the 19th century, indeed, as it has been since the middle of the 19th century, the economic health of Vermont's dairy industry remained at the whim of forces outside of Vermont, forces that cared little about their consequences here. The local food movement in Vermont accelerated in the 2000s, leading to Vermonters producing more food and eating more food that was produced in the state. Thus far, however, it has had minimal effect overall on the state's agricultural economy. Human population and development. Vermont was one of the fastest growing states in the country from 1790 to 1830. It was the northern frontier, and immigrants were attracted by the open land suitable for subsistence agriculture, the dominant way of life in New England at the time. That a native Vermonter was not elected governor until 1835 was symbolic of this mobility. There was also mobility within the state as people headed north to open lands, to the valleys for mill sites and railroad access, and to the emerging cities. Burlington, the center of Vermont's only real urban area, which some might laugh at outside of Vermont, became the state's most populous city in 1840. The state's overall population growth, however, came to a virtual stop in the 1850s. Vermont had become too populated for subsistence farming, and it was a poor competitor in commercial agriculture and manufacturing. Emigration from the state increased, and the landscape of Vermont, which had supported native peoples for thousands of years, showed signs of being worn out and depleted less than 100 years after the surge of European habitation had begun. For the next 100 years, Vermont's population grew slowly. The state largely missed out on the Industrial Revolution due to the difficulty of travel and transportation. It was a backwater, out of the way from southern New England, the eastern seaboard, and the Midwest. Roughly 50 years ago, this started to change. The major force shaping the modern Vermont landscape was human population growth. From 1960 to 1990, Vermont added nearly 173,000 permanent residents, almost a 50% increase. This was the greatest number of new humans ever to come to Vermont over a 30-year time span, surpassing even the period of the Republic and early statehood. This growth was due to several factors and led to a number of fundamental changes in the state. The main causes for growth were the improved highway system, especially the interstate highways, the continued growth of tourism, which brought many to Vermont who decided to stay, and the changing nature of the economy towards services and light manufacturing, sectors in which Vermont could be more competitive. The greatest consequence of this growth were dramatic population increases in some communities, especially Chittenden County and towns near ski areas, tremendous land development pressures, and various attempts to control development, most notably Act 250. In terms of percent growth, the 1990s were the last decade of significant population growth that began in the 1960s. While the first decade of the 21st century witnessed the slowest growth of any decade since the 1940s. Nationally, Vermont grew quite slowly compared with other states, ranking 38th in the 1990s and 44th in the 2000s. The population growth that did occur more recently in Vermont varied by region, with growth strongly concentrated in Chittenden County, centered on Burlington and its suburbs. Half of the state's counties grew above the state average from 1990 to 2010, but Chittenden County constituted nearly 40% of the state's growth, and 4 of the other above-average growth counties are neighbors of Chittenden. 2 counties, Essex and Rutland, lost population during this period. The pattern was even more extreme from 2000 to 2010, when Chittenden County accounted for nearly 60% of the growth in the state of Vermont. In the first 150-plus years of Vermont's history, when one spoke of the 2 Vermonts, one meant East Vermont and West Vermont, divided by the Green Mountains, or Hill Vermont and Valley Vermont. More recently, this division seems to be between metropolitan Burlington, which has enjoyed greater population growth and a more robust economy, and the entire rest of the state. Despite this increased growth in Chittenden County, Vermont still remains overwhelmingly rural, at least as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau. The percent of people living in rural areas increased from 62% in 1960 to nearly 68% in 1990 before declining back to 61% in 2010, which tied Vermont with Maine as the most rural state in the nation. This map indicates two of the drivers of this population change: the interstate highway system and major ski areas in the state. Vermont author Joe Sherman wrote that the interstates, quote, that the interstates and the new ski areas they served changed the face of Vermont more than anything had since the Ice Age, unquote. The obvious effect of the interstates was that it made it easier for people to come to Vermont and for Vermont businesses to ship products elsewhere. The shorter travel time to Vermont made it a more attractive place for tourism, especially long weekends for skiing, viewing the fall foliage, and just getting away. Burlington to Boston, depending on how fast you might drive, 3 hours and a half, 3.5 hours, 3 hours and 45 minutes. It cut in half, more than half the time that it would take to get up. So you can imagine coming up to Vermont from Boston for a ski weekend if you wanted to go to Stowe before the interstates really didn't make much sense, whereas it's fairly easily done today. So skiing, viewing the fall foliage, just getting away. The improved roads and changing economy also made Vermont a more attractive place to do business, really than at any previous time in its history. And these better roads placed Vermont in the heart of a dynamic region among Boston, New York, and Montreal. Largely in response to this increased development, Vermont passed Act 250 in 1970. This law requires any major development anywhere in the state to receive a state permit before it can begin. The project is judged on 10 environmental and municipal criteria. Most proposals receive permits relatively quickly, but they must make adjustments often to protect air and water quality, wildlife, and to prevent municipal services from being overburdened. The major development issues in the state today focus on preventing sprawl by concentrating development in existing towns and cities, and building energy infrastructure projects, which interestingly are exempt from Act 250. And maybe we'll return to that in the Q&A. Fourth, the rise of tourism. Tourism in Vermont began to flourish following the Civil War as the idea of a pastoral landscape gained prominence in the United States. But it was skiing that became the main catalyst to tourism in Vermont, as it continues to really be today, beginning at Stowe in the 1920s. The state helped further the ski industry by purchasing state forest lands, inviting the development of ski areas on them, including Mount Ascutney, Burke Mountain, Jay Peak, Killington, Okemo, Bromley, and Stowe. Mount Snow and Sugarbush were developed on national forest lands. So both these governments really helped along the ski industry and what came with it. By the 1980s, however, the attitudes of some Vermonters towards skiing began to change. What had been viewed as a perfect match for Vermont, development that complemented the beauty of the Vermont countryside and mountains, was being viewed as a source of problems. The large ski areas seemed constantly to be seeking to expand their trails, often into remote wildlife habitat, to expand their snowmaking, diverting water from streams which might hurt fish populations. In addition, these resorts also stimulated sprawl development and high land prices in small mountain towns. The honeymoon between Vermont and skiing was clearly over. Although it remains a popular and important economic sector, the ski industry often must fight long political battles to expand, as Killington has done, or to increase water withdrawal from snowmaking, as Sugarbush has done. That is a far cry from the days of the states acquiring land to help ski areas begin, or building access roads to connect them to state highways. Tourism evolved over the next several decades, continuing to be a major driver of the Vermont and shaper of the Vermont economy and a shaper of the Vermont landscape. In 2011, nearly 14 million visitors spent $1.7 billion in the state. Summer has become the peak time for travelers to come, where they enjoyed a wide range of activities. Skiing and snowboarding, a Vermont invention, continued to anchor the winter tourist economy. The trade association Ski Vermont counted 19 alpine and 30 Nordic areas among its members in 2013. However, since 1995, 3 downhill areas have closed: Ascutney Mountain, Maple Valley, and Haystack, which later opened as a private club. At the other end of the spectrum, substantial investments have been made at many resorts, including Jay Peak. Fall, too, captured significant visitors, with spring continuing to lag. Still haven't figured out what to do in mud season. In 2011, there were 42,000 second homes in the state, down by nearly 5,000 from the late 1990s. The global economic crash of 2008 contributed significantly to this decline. Fifth and finally, conservation. Beginning in the middle 1800s, as less farmland was needed for crops and pasture and less wood was used for fuel, the forest began to return to Vermont. By 1930, forests covered 60% of the state. Today, as I mentioned earlier, roughly 3/4 of the state is forested, although the composition of that forest looks quite different than it would have before. Trees were still cut for forest products and fuel. Indeed, in the 1990s, a record amount of forest products were taken out of Vermont's forests. Many of the wild creatures that lived in Vermont that were extirpated after the state was colonized came back during this period too, often with human help. Beaver, deer, fisher, and wild turkey have all been reintroduced to Vermont and are doing quite well. They're really flourishing. New animals have migrated to Vermont as well in the last 100 years, most visibly the coyote and the turkey vulture. Also new to Vermont are a host of exotic species, unwelcome plants and animals from other parts of the world that are causing problems in the natural world, such as zebra mussels, purple loosestrife, and chestnut blight. Unfortunately, a number of the members of our natural community have been forced out since European settlement, like the timber wolf we see here. Middlebury and UVM's mascot, known variously as the mountain lion, panther, or catamount, was eliminated from the state by the end of the 19th century. Also gone are elk and caribou, wolverine and Arctic char, timber wolf, and at least 8 species of plants. Gone forever is the passenger pigeon. Again, another photo from the Natural History Museum in New York. Flocks of these birds once filled the skies over Vermont and elsewhere, but the last passenger pigeon died in a Cincinnati zoo in 1914. At the beginning of the 20th century, the state and federal governments began to acquire land for conservation purposes. These state forests, state parks, and wildlife management areas now total roughly 350,000 acres. The Green Mountain National Forest, started in 1932, today includes nearly 410,000 acres. To the west, approximately half of the land in the Adirondack Mountains is owned and protected by New York State. And this is a map of these lands. Here we are down here, Green Mountain National Forests. This is from 1995, the map, Adirondacks. Green Mountain National Forest. To the north of the Green Mountains, National Forest, which ends around Mount Abraham, where we started, these big blocks are state forest lands and the wildlife areas, and then the White Mountain National Forest over here. A newer form of conservation that has flourished in Vermont is land trusts. These organizations purchase conservation easements on farmland and forest land, and the easements prevent the development of land, but allow continued farming and forest management. Over 500,000 acres in Vermont are protected by such easements. So depending on how you add up these different conservation lands, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of Vermont is conserved, either under public ownership or these conservation easements. As the forests of Vermont returned, as the state's population greatly increased, as Vermont became more and more integrated, as the forests of Vermont returned, as the state's population greatly increased, as Vermont became more and more integrated into a global economy and society, Vermont acted both privately and publicly to protect the landscape. These efforts covered a wide spectrum, from federal wilderness to conservation easements to protect working farms, from endangered species laws to active game and fish management. But in some sense, these actions, except those dealing with agricultural lands, have been trying to reassemble a natural landscape mosaic out of one that had been changed completely by the mid-1800s. Although nearly 20% of Vermont's land became protected to some degree, much of this land is still greatly fragmented. One conservation lesson society is still learning in Vermont and elsewhere is that it is a lot harder to put something back together than it is to take it apart. Most of the major pollution problems facing Vermont are generated far beyond the state's borders: acid rain, toxic air pollution, greenhouse gases. The major homegrown problem is non-point source water pollution, generated by a combination of the state's farms and, especially in Chittenden County, residential and commercial development. And this has led to a major initiative to try and reduce pollution entering Lake Champlain. One of the reasons Vermont has relatively few environmental problems compared to other places, beyond the low population and industrial footprint, is that we import so much of our food, energy, and other goods. Indeed, such connections with regional, national, and international economies form the foundation for one of the great ironies of Vermont's history. The return of Vermont's forests and the rise of its reputation as an environmental success story has, in fact, been made possible only by the globalization of Vermont's economy. In the middle of the 19th century, when Vermont was at the nadir of its forest cover, the land was supplying virtually all the food and energy for the people who lived there. The return of the forest could only occur when Vermonters were able to acquire the resources they needed by taking them from other landscapes. Today, the forest is largely back, albeit in a greatly modified form, but Vermont's human population, which is nearly double that of 1850, imports most of its food and energy. In other words, Vermont's ecological footprint extends far beyond its borders. This is a lesson that should be kept in mind as society increasingly discusses sustainable development. The recent rise of local foods and the local energy movements, however, promise more meaningful conversations about sustainable Vermont. And what of the future? Well, there are certain things that we do have some say over in Vermont, such as how we develop our land. Do we have compact downtowns? Do we keep farmland in farming? What we spend on local food, how we and where we get our energy from. But there are other things that we can't control and will continue to be at the mercy of larger national and international trends. Does IBM sell its chip plant to global foundries? Does it shut down in Essex Junction, which I think is now down to about half its peak in terms of employment? What happens with dairy production elsewhere? And what happens in terms of global climate change. So with that, I'd like to stop my formal remarks and open up for discussion, questions about the future, past Vermont, what your thoughts are, what you'd like to talk more about. So, thanks.